What went wrong with that was everything. Don't mess around with their home time. Don't mess around with their paycheck. They're out there on the road. They're trying to make money. And all of a sudden you're saying you can't go home and your paycheck's going to be different. I'd be upset too. I guarantee if you get into a crash, the other lawyers are going to look at that data and go, hey, we saw this pattern here. Why didn't you?
Welcome to This Week in Trucking. This is the podcast that talks to real trucking business owners and trucking professionals in the space to help you learn more about how to make your trucking business more profitable. My name is Caroline, and today we have an awesome guest. Sam Watts is the founder of Wattsmen Diesel House. He is a trucking safety strategist, and he helps people be safer out on the road and make more money with their business. Thanks so much for being here, Sam.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Can you tell me what it is that got you into truck safety?
Ooh, man, how long of a show do we got? Because I could go on forever. My father got me into it. So I've been in trucking my whole life, and I've always been on the operations side, dispatching, director of operations, stuff like that. I've always been around trucks, trailers, all that kind of stuff. What got me into the safety side of it was my father started his own trucking company a handful of years ago, and I was doing operations for him. And I had come from large companies, and same as him, we always were in bigger companies. And so we always had just different departments to handle stuff. When you're in a small company and starting it out, you don't have those departments. You are that department. And so we need a department. I knew enough about safety to be dangerous, as they all like to say, but I didn't really pay much attention to it until the FMCSA came and paid us a visit for their end of the first year little audit that they like to do. And we got smoked basically on that. We dropped from a satisfactory rating down to a conditional rating. It wasn't that we were like doing anything really bad. It's a lot of people, like what I see is just we didn't know what we didn't know. And so from there I was like, we got to figure this out now. And so I put myself in charge of that and really started to understand the safety piece and why people, or why the FMCSA does what they do and what they're looking for and how to do things better. And that's really where it started with my journey in safety, is I got from a conditional back up to a satisfactory and went on from there. And that was how I got started in the safety piece of trucking. And I haven't looked back since.
If you were to name some of the most common pitfalls that you see, common mistakes small carriers making in safety, what would they be?
Ooh, that's a great question, because there's a couple different ones that kind of always pop to the top of my mind. The biggest one is, and I get why small companies can't do this, because a lot of times it's just one person or two people that are trying to run it. And sometimes, here's the dirty little secret with safety. Here we go.
We like secrets.
The dirty little secret with safety, it might not be, but in my eyes, that you can get away with stuff in safety. And that's what one of the biggest pitfalls with when it comes to small carriers is that they get away with being, and I'm not saying that they're trying to, but you can go over your e-log hours and not get caught. You can do a lot of stuff that you're not supposed to do and not get caught. The problem is that when you do get caught, that's when a lot of the issues really arise. And here's the thing is, you never know when you're going to have to produce a logbook, or you never know when the FMCSA is going to come look at you. But you just never know really when it's going to come back to bite you. So a lot of times they ignore a lot of stuff that they're supposed to be doing and just keep going with the mindset of, we haven't gotten caught, so let's just keep going. All of a sudden your CSA scores are starting to go up. If you're not paying attention to those, you have no clue. And then all of a sudden you will get that letter from the FMCSA saying, hey, we want to take a look at your stuff. And all of a sudden you go, I have nothing. So that's ultimately one of the biggest problems in the safety world, is that you can get away with being unsafe in a trucking company. That's why I always like to preach of having a foundation of safety. And the carriers that I work with, that's what I really try to instill in them, is that you got to have your foundation of safety. Now, if you don't have it to begin with, the good news is that you can always pour it later. If you're still a business, you can still get that foundation going. So that's why people like me come into companies and help them out with that. But yeah, it's not getting caught. And then the other thing is, maybe they know that they're not supposed to do something, but they keep going anyways with it, or they don't have someone that can monitor it. And they have these policies and these procedures in place, but they have no one to keep an eye on it. And that's also another, too, because God forbid if they get into a big, serious accident or crash, the lawyers, DOT, they're all going to want to see your policies and procedures. And if you say, here they are, and they find out that you're not following or enforcing any of them, then you're going to be in really big trouble when it comes to that as well.
Right. So you're saying the consistency of the enforcement is what leads people to have poor safety practices. Yeah. And if they had a foundation that said, we're not doing this because it's the law, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. Sure. It's the right thing to be safe, right? Yeah. And if that's your foundation, and then you just make sure that you're compliant with all the laws on top of, that's going to be a much better way of approaching safety, as opposed to, let me see what's the minimum that I can get away with.
Right. There's a number of things that I do that aren't necessarily necessary, for lack of a better term, but it's one of those where, okay, so you don't have to have a continuous MVR monitoring system in place, like a system that works on the back end to make sure that drivers' licenses are still valid and things like that. That's not a necessary.
Spell out MVR for us. For someone who doesn't know, what's an MVR?
Oh, yeah. Motor vehicle report. So you have to run those once a year. You run them when you bring on a new driver. It'll give you their basic traffic law information. So if they've got pulled over for speeding or things like that, the MVR will give you that information. You're supposed to pull that once a year to make sure that the driver is still valid or whatever. However, there are a number of technology pieces out there that will continuously monitor those MVRs for you. Because here's the thing, I've had this happen to guys that I've been watching where there's a couple scenarios that a driver can get himself into where if they don't follow up with the state that their license is with, they can get their license downgraded. And they, a lot of times, don't even know that has happened until they get pulled in at a weigh station or something. And all of a sudden, the officer runs their license and goes, you don't have a valid CDL. And when that happens, then all of a sudden you get to step out of the truck in middle of nowhere, South Dakota, and figure out A, how to get home, and B, how to get your license back. And now all of a sudden the company's angry at you because now their truck and their trailer and their cargo is, again, sitting in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota. And don't ask me why I use South Dakota, because that's where one of my guys got shut down one time. It's like, what are we going to do now? So to your point before, it's not a necessary thing to have that continuous monitoring, but why wouldn't you do it? But there's a couple other pieces out there in the safety world. We have so much technology now, which is great, but it can also be bad too if you don't, like we were talking about before, if you don't have someone to monitor it. If you have all this data coming in that's literally just coming in and no one's looking at it, but you should have some. And here's the deal. If you're if you're not monitoring something and the data's continuing to come in, don't have that data come in. To be quite frank with you, it's better to not have that data and not monitor it than to have all this data coming in and not monitoring it. And that's kind of the one misconception too, especially nowadays when there's so much technology, is we just want everything. Just give us all this data. If you're not watching it, if you're not looking at it, I guarantee if you get into a crash, the other lawyers are going to look at that data and go, hey, we saw this pattern here. Why didn't you? And then you got to explain that piece.
And it's not just about, oh, when are you going to get pulled over? It's in the worst case scenario, thing really tragic, or in the best case in a crash, it's inconvenient, it's expensive. And in the worst case, it's life-threatening, right? Yes. And if you get into one of those, the added stress of knowing that you're not really on top of your safety for your business, that's something that's an optional thing that you've chosen over many months of not being careful about keeping track of that stuff. So why would you even take that risk?
Right. I always tend to look at everything that I implement or all the procedures that I help companies out with. I always look at can you defend this in a court of law? Because you don't, and I hate the scare tactic piece of safety. I really try not to lead with that, but ultimately that's where it falls down to, is this defendable, what you're doing? Because I've seen some pretty bad accidents out there in my time with safety and just in trucking in general. I have yet to have a driver call me in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to have an accident this afternoon. You just never know when it's going to happen. And if you're being retroactive on everything, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So the best thing is to get proactive, be in front of it, know that your driver qualification files are good, know that your drivers are following the rules when it comes to logs, policies and procedures are in place, discipline policies. I know that some people try to shy away from that because then that means some of the drivers might get mad at you. It's what sometimes has to happen. But the good drivers will understand what you're trying to do. And that's a thing that I really try to get through because I'm a millennial. I'm an old millennial, but I still fall into that category. And mine is like, why? Why do you want this? Why should I do it this way? Why are we doing this? So that's what I really try to explain. Hey, we're putting, or maybe not even us, but like the FMCSA is putting these policies in place because for this reason. And so that's why we have these discipline policies, because we don't want to even go down that road. Because if you do, you're going to be in big trouble, not with us per se, but with the FMCSA, with DOT, that screws up your livelihood. So that's why we have this policy, so that we're trying to protect you. And usually when you explain it that way, they come around and understand and fall in line.
Yeah. Talk about the HOS regulations. I know that's a big area where people sometimes have misunderstandings about it. Can you talk about how small carriers, owner operators, people who are running, maybe 5 to 10 trucks at a time, how can you best control that?
If you can figure that one out, you let me know too, because there are definitely some guys that try to find every loophole out there. But the nice thing is now in 2025, we have this technology with the e-logs that I know a lot of drivers like to hem and haw at that a couple of years ago. In fact, I was working for a company, a large company, that was one of the first ones to put e-logs in all their trucks. And that was terrible from a dispatcher standpoint. All day long, we got calls saying, I'm throwing this thing out the window. And quite frankly, we wanted them to as well, because it was impeding on our ability to move them down the road. But now they're here. The technology is great with them, and they're not going away. So that's why I always tell guys too, is that just get used to the e-log system, get used to the hours of service now, because it's not going away. Because it's so nice as a safety guy that I can type in on my computer and say, okay, Billy's got 3 hours left. He can go pick this load up. Or, oh, he's only got 3 hours left. He can't make it all the way. Like, it saves us a conversation with the driver too, and saying, look, he can't do this one. We're gonna have to figure something out. Or, yes, he can. A lot of drivers will get confused because there are some exemptions that come with hours of service. So you can drive 11 hours a day. You can drive, or you can work 14 hours a day, and then you got to take a 10-hour break. There are some exemptions in there. There's adverse driving conditions exemption, which gives you some more time. There is, you can do a split clock. You can split your break, and that gets into a lot of really fun math that I'm not going to get into right now, but it can get a little confusing. And so that's one of the biggest pieces I see with drivers too, is that trying to maximize their hours of service, which I get, that's their livelihood, but sometimes they just don't do it correctly. And so continuous education from a safety guy standpoint, that's what I always try to get through to them, say, hey, there are some exemptions. This is how to properly use them. This is how not to use them. If you're running local, you sometimes don't have to even use an e-log system. If you own a farm, you're in the Wild West, basically. You got that agriculture exemption. You can do whatever you want under 150 miles, basically. There are some rules. Just as a disclaimer, you can't do anything you want. I just want to make sure that's clear. You get some farmers out there just going everywhere. But no, so there are different exemptions for different. I work with some tanker companies that there's sometimes fuel exemptions, especially when it gets really cold. They got to get that fuel moving, the propane moving. So it's just a matter of knowing what you're pulling and then knowing the exemptions, because like with the tanker stuff, sometimes the guys will be in Illinois, they have an exemption. They hit the state line in Iowa, they don't have the exemption. So it really on the driver to then understand as well where they're going, what they're getting into, just things like that. And as a safety guy, and even as dispatch and operations, I always try to teach them about hours of service, because you'd be amazed at how many people responsible for moving the trucks don't know the hours of service. And a big thing too with brokers, I talk to a lot of brokers that just have no idea how hours of service work, so they're trying to give these drivers an 800-mile run overnight. And it's like, guys, that doesn't work. It's only this far. It's, I know, but he legally can't run that. And then you have to instruct them. So the hours of service is good. I know they're looking at maybe tweaking some things here and there, but from my opinion, for what it's worth, I think it's good. I I wholeheartedly agree that 10 hours is a good break, maybe even a little bit more if they can get away with it. But I think the hours of service is in a good spot right now. And I don't think it's going to change too drastically one way or the other.
You mentioned up front that one of your first experiences managing or witnessing a big compliance and safety project was your new carrier safety audit when you were working for your dad's business. That didn't go so well at that point. So can you give us a guide to what went wrong when you were doing that and how you now consult businesses on how to do that audit?
Yeah, what went wrong with that was everything. Okay, we didn't have anything in place really. We basically hired on a driver or had 2 or 3 drivers and said, go. And from there, we had them drive. We were making money. Everything was going great on that standpoint. But the biggest one that we got hit with was we didn't have a driver qualification file for these guys. Every driver needs to have a driver qualification file. We had an application for some of them. We had a copy of their license, but like we didn't have med cards in there because we didn't know to ask for med cards. That's one of the biggest things that I see with a lot of companies is that, again, they just don't know what they don't know. These small companies that I work with, it's a former driver that did very well, bought a second truck, did well, bought another truck, and all of a sudden now he's got a truck of 5 or 6, up to 10, 15 trucks. He still has that driver knowledge. He can drive that thing up and down the road all day, but he doesn't know the back end piece of it. And so that's where guys like me come in because it's like, yeah, you got to make sure you have your med card in there, application, driver's license. The big one that a lot of people miss is with the med card is the medical examiner registered on the registry that the FMCSA puts up. You have to have proof of that. So that was our biggest deal, is that we just did not have the stuff that we needed to in place. And then the other thing too is we weren't monitoring hours of service. Like we had one guy, it was always a joke with us to say, get it there, I don't care how you do it, wink, nudge, nudge. And a lot of the guys took us seriously with that. And so one guy just ran personal conveyance everywhere. And he's doing really good. He's making us a lot of money. Let's keep going. That's the attitude that will get you in a conditional rating, if not worse. And so when the audit came in and they looked at stuff, they go, guys, you are doing terrible right now. We probably should have had a non-satisfactory rating. I think we sweet talked him. My father is an excellent salesman. And so he probably sweet talked him into giving us a little bit more of a chance and got the conditional. But even with the conditional rating, it sucks because brokers will stop working with you. Banks will stop working with you. All of a sudden you have this great lane that the shippers will, because everyone's got access to all your safety data. None of it is private for good reasons. You don't want bad actors out there on the road. So as soon as we got hit with that conditional rating, it was like everything dried up until we had to get it fixed. And so we got the DQ files in order. I went on to so many webinars and websites and talked to anybody I could find about safety stuff and just said, what do we got to do here? I had a friend of mine that was doing some safety stuff. And so he came in and he helped us out with some of it. When you are trying to get back up to satisfactory rating, you got to submit stuff to the government. If you're going from a conditional to a satisfactory or even a non-satisfactory to a satisfactory, you have to basically present a plan to them and like an official legal looking letter and saying, hey, we want to be considered to be back at satisfactory. Here's what we're going to do. And they'll kind of keep you on the ball with that. And luckily we did all that we said we would, and we got back to satisfactory, but it's not a great process. And to be quite honest with you, they could say no if they want to. They don't have to bump you back up to satisfactory. So it was not a fun process, but it's something that a lot of people have done. Now, there are trucking companies out there that have been in conditional ratings for years, and it works for them. Like they have customer freight. It's working for them. So some of those guys really don't even have an interest to go back to a satisfactory rating. And to be quite honest, sometimes it actually, if conditional is working for you and you're still being safe out there, sometimes it's not worth going back up to satisfactory because then you get the feds looking at you again. So it's a complicated world in safety. But yeah, the biggest thing was not having the back end piece, because the FMCSA wants to know that the trucking company knows that the people they have out there on the road should be out on the road. And that's where the driver qualification files come in saying, look, we've done our due diligence. Here's the drug tests. Here's the negative results. Here's the CDL that is valid. Here's the MVR. Here's the med card. All that stuff has to be in the DQ file, which we didn't have hardly any of that. And that's usually the first thing I look at with other companies is, let's see your DQ files. What do you got in there? And about 90% are usually almost there, but they're at 90%. Very few actually have a full, complete DQ file. And a lot of them have, here's a piece of paper. I'm like, okay, we're starting at 0. Okay, cool. But again, that goes back to that safety foundation. Even if you don't have the DQ file, so you can build that. Okay, and that's something that you should have, because if a driver were to get in an accident and lawyers want to see that stuff, you got to present it to them. And if you don't have, or if they've got a failed drug test in there and you put them in anyways, ooh, now you're in big trouble. So it's best just to go through the process and onboard the driver in the correct way. And then you have that in the back. And then you got to make sure you keep it updated too, because CDLs expire, med cards expire, MVRs expire. That's the other piece too, is that here's my DQ file. My CDL is 8 years old. Hey, where's the new one? So that's also the other piece too, is that making sure you keep it updated.
We have a report, a blog on our website about DQ files. So we'll link that in the description here with all of those. And Sam, maybe I'll send it to you so you can critique my understanding of the DQ files. There's a lot that goes in there. It's not just something that can fit on a piece of paper. And I think one of the other mistakes that people make is that if they're an owner operator, they just have one truck and they're the driver, that they think they don't need one. Still definitely need one. And you don't have to apply to a job for yourself, but everything else applies to you. So you have to make sure you have all of those records ready for you. And
I did some work for a company that the owner didn't have a DQ. Everyone else had one, but the owner is like, well, I own it. I'm like, hey, you still need one, buddy.
Doesn't matter. You're driving 40,000 pounds down the highway at 65, 70 miles an hour. The government wants to make sure that all the people doing that are highly qualified and safe.
Yep.
Yeah. Talk about vehicle maintenance compliance. So how regularly should people be checking up on those compliance requirements when it comes to vehicle parts, tires, brakes, things like that?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's one piece that a lot of people don't understand, how safety and vehicle maintenance actually are close together, because there's a lot of times that a vehicle will be put out of service for a safety reason. And that's why pre-trips, I always recommend post-trips as well, making sure that you just are checking out that vehicle, because a lot of guys will say pre-trips are required. Okay, I do a pre-trip. Great. But then you drove that truck 600 miles down the road for that day. Something could have gotten knocked loose, or a trailer light could have gone out. I've seen wires get disconnected, and it's best to get that looked at before you take your break, so we know, and maybe we can even get you to a spot before your break's done. But that's a vehicle maintenance and safety really do go hand in hand. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm an expert on vehicle maintenance. I'm not a mechanic when it comes to this stuff, but the guys that do that are, and here's the plug that I'll make to you guys too. If you want to be a diesel mechanic, this would be a really good time to get into it, because those guys, that is expensive work to do. I think I was just talking with a friend of mine. I think their shop is over $200 an hour now to have anything done, and he said that's a bargain. So I'm like, that is incredible.
Yeah, I've heard 300 and 400.
I wouldn't doubt it. Wouldn't doubt it at all. It's really getting out of hand. But like I said, the vehicle maintenance piece and safety really do go hand in hand, because you go into a weigh station. They do a level 1 inspection, meaning they're going to look all around your vehicle. They're going to get underneath of it. They put you out of service. Okay, now that out of service mark, or any sort of violation, even if you're not put out of service, you got a tail light out, you got something done wrong with the vehicle, that goes right over to your CSA data, because as there's the basic categories, and that's 7 different categories, and one of those categories is vehicle maintenance. And if you're high on that, the DOT is going to want to know what's going on with your vehicle maintenance piece. Yeah, it's extremely important to take care of your stuff. And I know different makers of the trucks have different recommendations for when to do preventative maintenance, but I highly suggest you do not ignore your preventative maintenance, because yes, right now a PM might cost you $600, $700, $800, maybe $500, whatever. And you go, man, that's a lot of money. I'd rather just keep it rolling, go down the road. If there's something that could have been caught in that preventative maintenance, happens out on the road, now all of a sudden you're looking at thousands of dollars. And so that's always one of the biggest pieces I recommend. I'm not a mechanic, but I highly recommend you get a good one because they will save you thousands of dollars down the road by just taking a look over. A lot of drivers too are very good when it comes to mechanics of their truck. They know if something's not quite right. And I always tell owners who maybe don't have that mechanic background to definitely listen to the drivers. If there's something not right with that truck, they of all people will know. They're the ones driving that thing hundreds of thousands of miles. They're going to know if it's got a shimmy to it. They're going to know if it's pulling to the right. They're going to know if it doesn't sound right. And so I always say, make sure you listen to the drivers too. If they've got a concern, get it in there, bite the bullet, pay the mechanic fee, and get that thing done. Because like I said, I'd rather spend $500-600 at my shop versus $2,000-4,000 out on the road by a mechanic I don't even know. Or sometimes, here's the beauty part, if you get put out of service by a DOT officer, now you got to get the mechanic to come out to you. So now there's automatically like a $1,500 charge just for them to come out to you. And anything on top of that is just, yeah, it's painful. So don't ignore the maintenance piece because that directly does tie in with your safety piece of the company.
Yeah. Mechanic fees, fines, all of those are really obvious ways that poor safety and compliance management can hurt your bottom line. But one that may be underestimated is the way that it can affect your insurance. I've heard of lots of carrier businesses going out of business just because they couldn't afford the renewal of their insurance. Can you talk about the relationship between CSA scores, maybe talk a little bit about what that is, the safety information that's available on the internet for all to see, and how that can affect insurance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not a lot of people really put those two worlds together. And that's why I try to preach this foundation of safety, because it does connect with so many different worlds out there. It connects with your maintenance, it connects with your operations, and yes, it connects with your insurance as well. Because like I said before, all of your safety data is publicly available, especially to insurance companies. They have their own reports that will grab that FMCSA data and they'll get to you. Like before I was concentrating on safety, we would have our insurance guys tell us our safety scores. And it's like, man, how are you figuring this out? That's amazing. And I said, it's out there. You should probably look at it. But yeah, they grab that CSA data, which CSA is basically the program that the FMCSA puts into place. Now, the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, they're the people in Washington. They're the guys underneath the Department of Transportation. They concentrate on the highway stuff. The CSA is the program that the FMCSA puts into place to judge the trucking companies, basically. So they have their 7 different categories, and each category are different violations that you can go. Now, if any sort of speeding ticket, any sort of driver on their cell phone, any sort of out of service, mechanical issues, if your driver gets pulled over without a valid CDL, all of that stuff gets registered in the CSA. And then when your insurance renewal time comes, your insurance company will take a look at all of your CSA data. And there's good insurance people out there, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times insurance companies, because there's so many trucking companies, they're just looking at the data. They're not looking at the story. They don't really care about the excuses behind it. So they're just purely looking at the data, and they're feeding that data to the underwriters who, again, I don't mean to demonize underwriters. They're doing what they do, but they don't care about a story, okay? They're just literally looking at, is this good? Is this not? They don't want to insure risky companies. And so if your CSA data in those 7 categories, you're ranked. A lot of times people will say, what's your CSA score? Really a score per se, it's a percentage. And in all those categories, usually it's at 65%. If you get enough violations, you will go above that threshold. And if you go above that threshold, you're deemed a risky carrier. Now, if you're over the threshold in one category, get it back under. There's probably not going to be too much happening. You're not probably going to get audited or anything like that. But if you start going over in 2 categories and go to 3 categories, that's when the DOT, the FMCSA are really going to be stepping in going, what are you doing? We need an intervention. We need an audit. We need to look at you. Same thing with the insurance companies, though. If they see, they have even less of a sense of humor than the FMCSA. If they see that you're elevated in categories, they might not touch you. Or if they do, they're going to say, hey, this much up front, it's 10 times more than it was last year. Yep. Take it or leave it. I've seen the same thing where companies are going fine. Renewal time comes. They say, oh, you got elevated that one. And they're gone. they can't get insurance. And it's a little unfortunate because sometimes there is a story behind some of those numbers, but sometimes there isn't. And, that's a really good indicator to insurance companies to say, this is a risky company. If they get into an accident, they're more likely going to be in a big accident, or they're more likely to get into multiple accidents. We don't even want to touch them. Insurance companies have lost their sense of humor when it comes to insurance, and they really don't like paying out, which I understand. And so if they're deemed risky by them, they're not going to insure you.
Another thing that I have heard from other trucking safety professionals is that sometimes the problem is that if you're not monitoring those violations, maybe your driver knows that they've had a couple of violations, but they're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of losing their livelihood. Then how do you communicate that to the rest of your team? And then how do you deal with these situations where you get violations that aren't even yours?
Yeah, that's a good point. The CSA website, there's the Safety Management System, the SMS. There's a website for that, and you can log into that via your FMCSA portal, and you can look at every violation that occurred, and you get where it occurred, what happened, who the driver was. All that data is there. And if you are surprised a couple months later when a driver comes and say, hey, a couple months ago I got a violation, that shouldn't be a surprise to you. You should be monitoring that information. And yeah, it gets updated once a month, and you can go in there and take a look. And there were numerous times where drivers I was watching, I would always say, it's just like my kids, okay? I got 4 boys. They're rambunctious.
Oh, wow.
I get it. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. They're rambunctious kids. And I always say this: if you do something wrong, come and tell me, okay? Because the punishment is going to be less severe if you tell me versus if I find it out, okay? And sometimes there's not even going to be a punishment, whatever. That's parenting 101. That's later on. But I always tell drivers that too. If you get a violation, tell me. Okay, because if I find out that you got a violation, it looks like you were trying to hide it, then what else are you trying to hide? Okay, well, how does your truck look? How's your hours of service look? All of a sudden, I don't trust you. Okay, but that has to go both ways. And one of the things I always try to do with drivers is actually make a relationship with them. Okay, that a lot of times I see safety guys, and I'll hear stories from drivers saying, oh, the safety guy's calling me. Because in the past, the safety guys only reached out when they were in trouble. That was the only thing they had was, you screwed up, now the safety guy's coming to you. I always try to make it with any driver I watch. I try to write down their birthdays and watch when they do something good. Send them out a text message on their birthday. Hey, bud, hey, happy birthday. Or, hey, I was looking at your hours of service. You haven't had one single violation of that for a month. Awesome. Thank you very much. You're making my life a lot easier. It's always a good idea to reach out to those drivers when they're not doing bad either. In fact, praise them when they're doing good. You would not believe the camaraderie you get from saying, happy birthday, Jimmy. And then all of a sudden, Jimmy's now your best friend because you just took that 10 seconds to remember something about it. That's all they really want. They want the recognition. They want a lot of cash too, but they'll take the recognition and the positive feedback, and all of a sudden you got a best friend, and now all of a sudden you got that line of communication open. Now all of a sudden Jimmy calls and says, hey man, I screwed this thing up so bad. I was doing 10 over. And I can say, okay, thank you for letting me know. Maybe there's a discipline policy in that. Maybe you have a 1 strike, 2 strike warning. I don't know, what every company's different. But at least you have that communication open, and they're not afraid to come and talk to you, which is, you have to make sure that they're not afraid to talk to you as a safety guy. But yeah, you're also correct too, that sometimes the DOT guys get it wrong. And so with that, there's a system called the data queue system, which if there is an error in your CSA or in your violation or inspection report, you can go on there and data queue it. Now, it's not the easiest thing to do as far as, like, it takes time, and it's a 50-50 shot, in my opinion. There's some guys out there that do it pretty good, that claim that they can do it better than others. But in my experience with it's 50-50. Sometimes, like, the officer will say, yeah, especially if there's an actual egregious error, like they put the wrong MC, they did something wrong, like that, you can get that. And a lot of times I see that with owner operators, where if they just recently switched, they'll still sometimes have their old MC number on the truck and set that down. And all of a sudden I get calls from another company saying, your guy just got us a violation. So that's what that's for. But yeah, you can make your case on the data queue system. And I've done that. I've won some, I've lost some. It's up to them as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, it is nice at least. And they're constantly tweaking that system as well. So hopefully they can get it down the line. But DOT officers are very well trained out there. They know what they're looking at. And sometimes a lot of of times they are pretty accurate, and it's tough to refute what they say, and I just go from there. But yeah, they do have that system in place should you want to use it.
It's something that you said made me think of drivers love cash. Who doesn't? Who in the world doesn't? What about incentives for staying safe? Safest driver awards or bonuses for no violations in 6 months? I'm making those up off the top of my head. Is that something that you've put in place before, and is it something you would recommend to carriers?
I recommend it to carriers as long as you can keep up with it. So when I say that, like, there's some carriers that will put some stuff in play that you're going to have a full-time accountant keep an eye on this, because they'll be like, if you do this and this, then we'll raise your last quarter's wages by 1 penny on it's. Oh my goodness, this is so convoluted.
A little too complicated sometimes.
Yeah. One of the best programs that I saw that they had in place, which was nice, was if they failed the DOT inspection. So they get pulled in for a DOT at a weigh scale or whatever. If they failed it, I think it was like $300 a fine that they do to it. Yeah, it was pretty steep. I didn't like the amount of the steepness of that, but I made my voice, I made my opinion clear. They made their opinion clear. We move on. But if they passed, if they got a clean inspection, they would get a $100 bonus. So it's really trying to incentivize them to say, make sure you get that $100 bonus. And there were times too, this is where that line of communication comes in, because there were times where a guy will say, hey, this happened, but here's the reasons why. And I would listen to that. Sometimes I would say, yeah, that's a legitimate reason. You're not going to get the $300. But then there are other times where it's like, you missed that. Okay. That should have gone a pre-trip. You're doing 10 over. That's completely on you. A lot of times they would be overweight. They'd be like, we were under 80,000 pounds, but you were 38,000 pounds on your rear axle. You're overweight, bud. There's nothing I can do about that. So those are the times where it's, yeah, that's a painful lesson to learn. But then you do get the incentive if you pass it. And I like handing out those incentives a lot more than the penalties.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's something that just reminded me. If you only give the carrot and there's no stick, you might be in a situation where the driver says, I don't really need that $100, so I'm just gonna slack off, or I don't really care about that. So you do want to make sure that the consequences of violations or failed inspections are clear, and adding a carrot can help it be less maybe adversarial, right? If the safety persons, or maybe it's the business owner that's running safety, especially if you only have a couple trucks, right? The business owner themselves is likely running that safety program. And then it probably makes that job a little more fun, that you don't always have to be the bearer of bad news. You can also make safety somewhat of a pleasant experience for your drivers.
Yep. Make safety fun again. That's the motto. Yep.
Nice.
Not sure if it was ever fun, but hey, why not?
Why not make it fun? Hey, it saves lives. Who doesn't like doing that? That's something that a lot of people dream of. And there's so much risk involved in driving trucks. And if you frame it that way, instead of this sort of adversarial relationship that a lot of people will have with safety or compliance, that I'm just checking a box, that this is just a hassle for me. If you can reframe it as, this is just the right thing to do. This is the role that we have in our economy, in our society, that comes with so much responsibility, and managing that responsibility is serious. It's serious business, and it saves lives. And there's no reason that we can't make that part of the purpose of our business.
100%. Yep. I agree with you. Like, trucking is such a risky business to be in. Like you said, we're moving a lot of weight really fast down very public roads. And anything that I can do to help teach the drivers, teach the operations, just teach the general public even, like, how to do this safely. Yeah, there's going to be crashes. There's nothing I can do about that. Things are going to happen. Drivers aren't going to be paying attention. Drivers are going to fall asleep. We're going to have cars running into us. A lot of times, you wouldn't believe how many times a car will run into a massive semi-truck. It's just, I just won't see them. We're so distracted behind the wheel anymore. Truck drivers are as well too. They've got dispatchers calling them all the time. They've got the GPS going. There's just a lot of distractions out there. So anything I can do to help the industry so that, it's a risky industry, but we can make it as safe as we possibly can. Like, that's what I want to do. And that's what my whole mission is with doing all my safety stuff now.
I also liked what you said, bringing the spotlight. I do think that drivers are often under a magnifying glass when it's not always that's not always the person that's creating that risk. A lot of the time it's people in the operations department, or it could be the dispatcher, it could be the broker themselves that's really pressuring something to get delivered in an unreasonable time frame. And zooming out and seeing it's not just a driver problem. Yes, there's a lot of responsibility on the driver because that's the very end of the whip, if you want to call it that. But there's so many other things in the chain that are going to affect how the driver might behave. And oftentimes the driver might have to push back. And I imagine that they do. And comment below if you're one of those drivers that's had a situation where you have had to push back on someone else in your organization or your company to say, hey, I'm not going to do that because that's not safe. And empowering drivers to do that, I bet that that can be a challenge because they're often the end of that chain.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of times drivers will literally put their job on the line to push back because there's some unscrupulous owners, dispatchers, stuff out there that will say, you do this, and they say, no, that's dangerous or illegal, and they say, then get out of my truck. Unfortunately, it does happen. And that's why I try to educate the dispatchers, the operations, so that they understand too. If a broker tries to give them a load saying, hey, this has to be here tomorrow and it's X amount of miles, so the dispatcher can quickly do the math and go, no, he can't do that. And now all of a sudden the dispatcher is the advocate for the driver, and then educating the broker on their end. It's like, this is not possible to do. I worked with brokers for a number of years, and there were a lot of times where that conversation would happen. Like, I wouldn't even get to the driver piece of it yet because I'm like, they don't need to be burned with this. I know what the rules are. You don't know. So now I'll tell you what we're doing. But yeah, if a dispatcher doesn't know, and that's one of my things too with, I don't understand why it is seen as an entry level position into trucking. I get like if you go to a trucking company, like, it's dispatcher. We'll put you as a dispatcher. Do you know how much information you have to know as a dispatcher about the trucking industry to really do a good job at dispatching? It's a pretty thorough job if you've never been in trucking. And I see a lot of that where they'll bring in, and to no fault of their own, they'll bring in these 22, 23-year-old kids out of college, and they don't know. It's the same thing. They don't know what they don't know. And so they educate them like, hey, your driver can't drive 24 hours a day. You got to give them a break. And so it really, that's why safety, it just can't be a safety person and the driver. It's got to be through the whole company. Like, the whole company has to understand safety and why it's important and what the rules are. Now, they don't have to be intricate. They don't have to tell me what the 7 basic categories are that they'll be judged in, but they need to know that this driver only has 11 hours to drive today. After that, they got 3 hours to work if there's something in there, and then they got to take a break. And when they're on their break, you don't bug them, okay? Let them get their break. Make sure, don't mess around with their home time. Don't mess around with their paycheck. Okay, that's 2 big things that I see a lot of dispatchers kind of toy with. And it's, those are 2 things to really make a driver upset. And I don't blame the driver at all, because they're out there on the road, they're trying to make money, and all of a sudden you're saying you can't go home and your paycheck's gonna be different. I'd be upset too. But yeah, it's just that knowledge of, this is how a trucking company works. This is how the safety piece works. Be an advocate for the driver out there against people who don't know what the rules are. That's why I try to teach everyone what the rules are.
We've talked about this on the show before, of dispatching services too for smaller companies. So a lot of bigger companies will have their own dispatchers in-house. Some smaller carriers might have that too, but a lot of times if you're an owner operator or you're running just a couple of trucks, then you might be tempted to hire a dispatcher that's going to charge you a % of your loads. And that can be good. It can work. We always recommend that you dispatch your own loads, at least for the first couple of months or year, because then you'll really learn what it means to book loads and do that. But if you are going to hire a dispatcher, drill them on HOS regulations first. So before you sign any agreement, before you say, yeah, why don't you come and dispatch for my company? Hey, if you don't know the answers to these questions, go home, look it up, learn it, and then let's talk. That's got to be a basic thing. Not, can I get $4 per mile? And all of that should come after. Do you understand what it means to dispatch a truck for this many days, this many miles? What does all of that actually mean? And then we'll talk about what rates we want and all of that.
And even to that point too, okay, do you know the HOS stuff? But do you just even know the trucking in general? Okay, I'm getting $4 a mile to go from, I don't know, Indianapolis to Jackson, Mississippi. Okay, great. But the loads coming out of Jackson, Mississippi are paying 97 cents a mile. So it's like, even just that common knowledge of where the hot zones at, where should I be going? Don't ever send a guy to Florida. I'm kidding. I like Florida, but it's got a reputation of just not having anything coming out of it. So,
yeah.
But it's just that common knowledge. And that's why, like I said, I don't understand why dispatch is the entry-level position, because, again, they need to know. Now, some bigger companies will have planners, and I get that, and then dispatch is just relaying the information. But again, you still have to know what.
Yeah, even in relaying the information, though.
Yeah, 100%.
I don't need somebody, as someone who hires people, I don't need someone to just repeat what somebody else said. Like that's not useful to me. Yeah. A dispatcher needs to be really good at critical thinking and consequential thinking. If I do this, then what happens next? If the driver does this, what happens next? Yeah, I agree. I think that the idea that it would be an entry-level position, the problem is that there's no dispatcher license, right? Somebody who drives a truck has to have a CDL, a semi-truck, right? If you have a Class A truck, then you need a CDL. And that weeds out people who don't know how to do it and don't know what they're doing.
When all said and done, there's 950 rules to follow in trucking. Wow. Now, not all apply to everything, but there's a lot of regulations out there. And my whole thing with that is, these are the regulations, and this is why it's important. Now, I will say, in full disclosure, I don't agree with every regulation out there. I don't agree with every rule that the FMCSA puts in place. We didn't even touch like personal conveyance and all that kind of stuff, which I think is extremely a gray area, and that's for a whole nother podcast. But there are some things that kind of bug me about it. But at the end of the day, it's like, these are the rules that are set up, and this is why you need to follow. And not even say you have to follow them because this is the rule. This is why it's in your best interest to follow these rules and regulations.
Sam, tell us about Wattsmen Diesel House. Where can we learn more? How can people get in touch with you?
They can go to my website, wattsmen.com. That's Wattsmen, MEN.com. It's called Wattsmen Diesel House because it's all your safety needs under one roof, okay? So if you need help with HOS stuff, you need help pouring that safety foundation, I can help you. You need help monitoring it, I can help you with that. You're in big trouble in your conditional rating, I can help.
Awesome. If you have questions for Sam, go to his website, contact him, or leave them in the comments, because we will send him questions that you leave us in the comments, and I'm sure he'll be gracious enough to help us answer them in those comments.
Well,
if you learned something about trucking safety on this episode of This Week in Trucking, please hit subscribe, hit the like button, and that way you'll never miss out on another episode. We'll be back next week. Thanks again, Sam, for joining us. Drive safe, everybody.
Thank you for having me.